everyone, I'm Patrick Gates, and today I have a question I'd like to ask you. Now, the question is, do you think that the Korean War was worthwhile? Now this may seem like a somewhat random question to you. I mean, the Korean War has been over for almost 50 years now. In fact, it's been over 50 years since it was finished. The Korean War seems like a relatively minor conflict in the US's long history, given the small nature of it. And in fact, many people choose to forget about this war, because it, quote, doesn't stand out. Now, the main reason for the war, and I think this is a very important thing to remember, was the conflict between communism and capitalism. Both the Korean Peninsula had before belonged to the Empire of Japan. Until the end of World War II, Japan was the absolute ruler of Korea, and basically dictated all of its laws. Once Korea was freed, however, the government was left up to the people rather than to a foreign government. Most of them chose a democratic form of government. However, the dominant communist regimes at the time decided to refuse this conclusion and split the country in half. In the north there was a communist regime, in the south there was a capitalistic one. In 1951, North Korea invaded South Korea. Though both Koreas had the intention to unite their peninsula eventually, North Korea acted on the impulse first. The US, and by extension the UN, both entered the war early on. The US had wanted to enter the war because Harry Truman was an avid anti-communist. He had seen the aggression that communists had displayed around the world and, in turn, displayed his own aggression as a countermeasure. He vowed that South Korea would be free by the end of the war. Eventually, however, China entered the war, and the entire war became a stalemate. Though there were seesaws in between the years of 1951 and 1953, the war eventually came to an end, with the border of the two Koreas essentially remaining the same. The ceasefire basically dictated that the UN and China would end the conflict. However, South Korea and North Korea are technically still at war. Now this may seem like a naturally untenable position to most of us. Having a war hanging over our shoulders constantly would be a horrifying idea. But in fact, South Korea has adapted generally well to the hostile environment in which it survives. South Korea even has a burgeoning film industry, which means that some of the more important needs, such as economic stability, have already been met. However, there is still the possibility that North Korea will go and restart the war, though South Korea may be responsible for restarting it as well. However, North Korea's regime has been the subject of a great deal of fear in the Orient, even to China, which is a powerful communist nation, as we all know. So if even another communist nation is losing its support of the North Koreans, then it's obvious that this regime is rather dangerous. South Korea, on the other hand, is outgoing and economically prosperous, as I mentioned earlier, which shows that the Korean War, in my opinion, was very much worthwhile. North Korea is oppressive and relatively poor, and the fact that South Korea is the exact opposite proves that our men's sacrifice was not in vain. The freedom enjoyed by the South Koreans is basically a gift from the United States, though the South Koreans fought hard for it themselves. I think people should decide not to just stop supporting a war just because it's incredibly violent, and I'll admit that that is a very good reason to stop supporting it. However, the causes of the war and the effects of it must be taken into account. A war is always, or at least in my opinion, it should always be, a weapon of last resort. Diplomacy and other measures should be taken first, but I think that the Korean War shows that war can and will solve some of the more difficult problems in modern diplomacy, though not all of them. In fact, it can cause some more, but still, the war in and of itself is not the main problem, it's the use. And the Korean War shows that if a war is done for the right reasons, it can yield effective results. Anyway, whether or not I've changed your views, I hope you enjoyed this speech. Thanks for listening.